When the floodwaters came in June, they destroyed every farm in the valley except one. While her neighbors watched their crops drown under thick silt, one 20-year-old farmer's fields survived. How? Because she had made a decision 6 months earlier that everyone thought was insane. She left an entire acre completely unplanted. This is the story of how one woman proved that sometimes the best farming advice isn't new, it's just forgotten. And it all started in an old equipment shed. But before we get there, you need to understand the world Ruby was living in. Because this isn't just a story about one farm, it's a story about an entire community trapped by a problem they thought was unsolvable. The Hatchie River lowlands aren't fancy. They're not pretty in a postcard way, but they are fertile. For generations, farming families have worked this land. They know every bend in the river, every seasonal pattern, every quirk of the soil. Farming isn't just what they do, it's who they are. The region is built on an unspoken rule. If the land is fertile, you plant it. Every square inch matters. When you're a farmer working on thin margins, with equipment payments due and seed costs rising every year, you don't leave productive land idle. This is Ruby Calloway. She's 20 years old, already deep in the family business, like most farmers in her community. Her father built the farm with his own hands. Decades of work went into developing the soil, maintaining crops, and building relationships with suppliers and dealers. It was a stable operation, not large, but steady. Then her father's health declined, and when a farmer can't work, the farm doesn't just suffer, it begins to collapse. Medical bills build up, equipment breaks down, a weak season becomes 2 weak seasons, and slowly, everything starts slipping. By the time he stepped back completely, the farm was close to breaking. Not fully destroyed, but dangerously close. The neighbors could see it. Farmers always can. They know when things are tight because they live the same reality. Dale Huckett had farmed next to the Calloway land for 30 years. Tom Pewitt had known Ruby's father since school. Earl Simmons remembered when the Calloway farm was one of the stronger ones in the area. They watched Ruby try to take over, a young woman suddenly responsible for holding everything together. But there was another problem affecting everyone in the region. The Hatchie River flooded regularly, and when it didn't just cover fields and move on. It left something behind that changed everything. Silt, thick, heavy silt that buried the soil. Fields that were carefully prepared and planted would end up covered in inches of sediment, sometimes more. The damage wasn't just loss of crops, it was the aftermath, the cleanup, the soil recovery, the months of work just to make the land usable again. And this happened again and again, year after year, sometimes multiple times in a single season. Farmers accepted it as part of life. You lived with it, you recovered, you tried again, but nobody had found a way to stop it. It was early March when Ruby decided to clean out her grandfather Earl's old equipment shed. It wasn't a sentimental decision, it was practical. The shed was full of old tools, broken equipment, and forgotten items. It needed clearing, so she started sorting through everything, selling what she could, throwing away what was useless, stacking the rest. And then she found the notebooks. Her grandfather's handwriting covered them, dates going back to the 1960s. Earl Calloway wasn't a scientist, but he was observant. He spent years studying how water moved across his land during floods, how it pooled, how it flowed, where it deposited sediment, where it eroded soil. He documented everything carefully. One idea appeared again and again in his notes. Native vegetation along creek banks acted as a natural buffer against floodwater. Dense root systems slowed water down, and when water slowed, sediment dropped before it reached the crops. He had observed it, tested it, compared cleared land with natural vegetation, and his conclusion was clear. Riparian buffer strips could protect farmland from flood damage. He even sketched out how to implement them, what they should look like, how they should function, how they should be maintained. He had discovered something important, and then it was forgotten. Earl passed away in the 1970s. The notebooks were stored away and never opened again. The knowledge stayed hidden while the problem continued year after year. Ruby read everything. everything, every page, every note, every observation, and when she finished, she understood what her grandfather had seen. It was mid-March, planting season. Every farmer in the region was preparing their fields. Timing mattered. Every decision mattered. Ruby stood at the edge of her property and looked at a fertile acre along Cane Branch Creek, and she made a decision that nobody understood. She would leave it unplanted. While other farmers prepared every inch of their land, Ruby left that section untouched. She preserved the native grass and sedge along the creek bank exactly as it was. The neighbors noticed immediately. Dale Huckett was the first to ask her about it. She explained her grandfather's notebooks. She explained the idea of buffer strips. She explained how water energy was absorbed and how sediment could be stopped before reaching crops. But he didn't fully believe it. Not because he thought she was lying, but because it didn't fit how farming had always worked in their minds. The same conversation happened again and again with other farmers. They were polite, curious, but skeptical. From their perspective, she was taking a financial risk she couldn't afford. Why leave fertile land unused when every acre matters? But Ruby wasn't guessing. She had studied, she had observed, and she believed there was logic behind her decision. Spring arrived, bringing heavy rains, and Ruby didn't just watch from inside. She went out during the rain and observed her land. She studied how water moved across the unplanted strip. She watched how the native vegetation responded. She observed where sediment was moving and where it was stopping. What she saw matched her grandfather's notes exactly. The vegetation slowed the water, the root systems disrupted its flow, the energy of the floodwater was reduced, and the sediment, the heavy damaging silt, dropped out before it could reach her crops. She documented everything carefully. Rain after rain, the same pattern continued. Light rain, heavy rain, storms. The buffer strip worked each time. Her crops remained cleaner than those of neighboring farms. But she said nothing. She waited, because the real test had not yet come. In early June, a major storm system moved into the region. It wasn't a normal rainfall event. It was multi-day, continuous, and intense. The Hatchie River began rising. Day after day, the water levels increased, 8 feet above flood stage, 10 feet, 11 feet, and then the flood came. Across the entire basin, fields were submerged. Crops were destroyed. The river spread across farmland. When the water finally receded, the damage was severe. Thick layers of silt covered the fields. Crops were lost. Soil was damaged. Recovery would take months. Farmers walked through their land in silence, trying to understand how to recover again. But then they noticed something. The Callaway farm looked different. The flood had reached it, but the outcome was not the same. The buffer strip had done its job. It slowed the water. It trapped the sediment. It protected the planted fields. Her crops were not buried in silt like the others. They had survived in a way that was immediately visible and impossible to ignore. And that is when everything changed. Farmers who had doubted her began to come forward. They asked questions. They apologized. They wanted to understand. How did she know? What had she done differently? Could she show them? Ruby explained her grandfather's notebooks again. This time they listened more carefully, because the evidence was right in front of them. Over time, something began to shift in the entire region. Farmers started implementing buffer strips along their creeks and waterways, slowly at first, then more widely. The agricultural community began to adopt the practice, and the results were clear. In future rain events, farms with buffer strips experienced significantly less damage, less silt, less soil loss, more stable recovery. The river still flooded. That never changed, but the impact was different. Stronger farms, better resilience, less destruction. And it all began with one decision, one forgotten notebook, and one person willing to trust old knowledge. Ruby didn't invent anything. She rediscovered something that had already been known, then forgotten. That is the real lesson of this story. Sometimes the answers we are looking for are not new. They are old, waiting to be remembered. So the question is simple. What knowledge are we ignoring today that someone already discovered yesterday?